Over 12,000 lives had been lost in the decade-spanning war in northern Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré understood that armed solutions had proven unsuccessful. Without informing anyone of his protection, he ventured into the wilderness to encounter one of the globe's most dangerous terrorist commanders. The days started routinely in President Ibrahim Traoré examined intelligence briefings during a modest morning meal in his residential quarters at the executive residence. The papers revealed a dire situation. Yet another settlement attacked. 23 non-combatants killed. Essential services destroyed. This cycle had continued for years throughout northern Burkina Faso, with state forces appearing unable to prevent it. Traoré placed the briefings to one side and approached the window. Beyond, he observed the metropolis stirring to life. Market traders preparing stalls, uniformed students walking to educational institutions, existence persevering despite the threat of brutality that had haunted the country for more than 10 years. After assuming leadership, he had attempted every strategy to terminate the rebellion: expanded military deployment, community engagement, economic investment in impacted areas. None had succeeded. The previous evening, he had obtained an unforeseen communication through an aged religious leader who had somehow secured entry to the executive complex. The spiritual figure had approached him following an official ceremony and slipped a folded document into his palm. From Muhammed El-Gazawi, the religious leader had murmured before vanishing into the gathering. El-Gazawi. Simply speaking, the identifier caused unease throughout the security apparatus. Commander of the Shadow of the Sahel, the most savage rebel organization functioning across the frontier territories of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, accountable for numerous brutalities. A phantom who had escaped attention for years despite global pursuits. The message had been concise: meet me unaccompanied. Tomorrow. Carry no armaments, no protection. Location details included. An opportunity for harmony. Any logical security evaluation would pronounce it an ambush. Traoré's counselors would universally prohibit his departure. International partners would declare it insanity. Nevertheless, as he observed his metropolis awakening in the dawn illumination, Traoré reached his conclusion. 10 minutes afterward, he departed his chambers wearing ordinary civilian attire: tan trousers, a lightweight fabric shirt, no insignia of authority. He informed his principal aide he was spending a personal day visiting his birth village and required no security escort, a partial truth that secured him the day, rather than his ceremonial transport. He selected an unmarked vehicle from the motor depot. The sentinel at the entrance barely acknowledged him, familiar with the president's unconventional approach and occasional desire for isolation. Beyond the capital, Traoré traveled northward. The terrain slowly changed from the verdant greenery of the south to the dry semi-wilderness of the north. He was well acquainted with these routes from his period as a military commander before becoming president. Each settlement he encountered reminded him of the human price of the struggle: deserted dwellings, security barriers, the exhausted expressions of inhabitants who had witnessed excessive violence. 6 hours subsequently, he reached the location specified in the correspondence. It was an isolated region near the Mali frontier, a disputed territory that governmental forces seldom entered. He positioned the vehicle beside a group of thorn trees and waited. Minutes extended into an hour. The midday sun blazed mercilessly. Traoré remained in the transport, uncertainties starting to emerge. Had he been drawn away from the capital for some alternative objective? Was an assault being executed while he sat in the wilderness? Then he spotted them. 3 pickup vehicles approaching from the north, dust formations billowing behind them. As they approached closer, he could distinguish the dark banners that had become associated with terror across the Sahel. Men with concealed faces and automatic weapons stood in the truck beds. It was too late for reconsideration. Traoré exited. His transport, empty palms raised slightly to demonstrate he was weaponless. The trucks created a half circle around him, motors running. Armed men descended, establishing a boundary. From the central vehicle, a tall figure appeared. Unlike his subordinates, Muhammed El-Gazawi's face was exposed. He was younger than Traoré had anticipated, possibly in his late 30s, with a neatly maintained beard and intense eyes that had witnessed their portion of warfare. He wore customary desert clothing, but carried himself with the posture of someone who had obtained military instruction. President Traoré El-Gazawi stated, his voice traveling across the distance between them. I did not anticipate you would arrive unaccompanied. Yet you requested it. Traoré responded steadily. An examination one you have succeeded in. Passing, El-Gazawi indicated a small shelter that Traore had not observed previously, erected beneath a solitary thorn tree several meters distant. Should we converse away from this temperature? The two leaders walked toward the shelter, encircled by vigilant combatants. Inside was basic: 2 cushions on a rug, a small surface with water and tea, nothing additional. They seated themselves, facing each other, 2 commanders from contrasting realms. Why did you arrange this encounter? Traoré inquired directly. El-Gazawi served 2 glasses of water, presenting one to Traoré. Because following 10 years of combat, neither of us is prevailing. Your forces cannot eliminate us. We cannot topple your administration. Meanwhile, our citizens suffer. Our citizens, Traoré observed the word selection. So you still regard yourself as Burkina Bay? I was born in Gibo, El-Gazawi confirmed, identifying a town in northern Burkina Faso. I pursued engineering in Ouagadougou before the initial government suppression in 2014. My sibling was detained, tortured, executed though. He had no associations to any militant organizations. That route was selected for me by your predecessors. Traoré nodded gradually. He had encountered similar accounts numerous times: the extremism of young men following harsh security actions by former administrations. And presently, what route do you select for yourself? El-Gazawi examined him momentarily before replying. That relies on what you provide. Not to me individually, but to the population of the north, the overlooked ones. For the subsequent hour, they conversed frankly about the struggle's fundamental causes. El-Gazawi described the northern community's complaints: exclusion by the central administration, absence of essential services, aggressive military responses, foreign military deployment that many perceived as neocolonial occupation. Listened more than he spoke, occasionally posing questions that showed his comprehension of the region's complicated dynamics. He had developed in similar conditions, in a settlement that had experienced its portion of difficulty. The distinction was that he had directed his frustrations into military duty and eventually political command, rather than rebellion. Organizations, methods targeting civilians, destroying educational facilities. How do these assist the population you claim to represent? Traoré eventually inquired. El-Gazawi's expression grew stern. Some assaults attributed to us were executed by others, some were executed by commanders I could not manage, and some, he paused, some were strategic. When foreign educators replace religious education, when charitable organizations bring foreign principles, when government structures represent oppression, these become objectives. Children have perished, Traoré stated simply. Children perish from absence of clean water, from preventable illnesses, from poverty daily in the north. El-Gazawi responded. Where was the government's concern before they became victims in news reports? The discussion continued, strained but constructive. Neither man surrendered moral superiority entirely, yet both recognized failures on their respective sides. The afternoon diminished. Traoré shifted the conversation. What would be required for the shadow of the Sahel to surrender weapons? El-Gazawi leaned backward, contemplating the inquiry. 3 elements. First, elimination of all French military deployment from Burkina Faso. Second, authentic independence for the Northern Territory's authority over local administration, education, resource oversight. Third, pardon for my combatants and a position at the table in national reconciliation discussions. Traoré had anticipated the first requirement. His own administration had already commenced reducing foreign military deployment. The second was complex but potentially manageable. The third would be politically explosive, and in exchange, he inquired, immediate cessation of hostilities, liberation of all captives, gradual disarmament, incorporation of those combatants who desire to join regular forces, my personal dedication to harmony. Your personal dedication, Traoré repeated. Can you manage all factions within your organization? El-Gazawi's uncertainty was revealing. 80% immediately. The remainder will follow when they observe the advantages of harmony. Those who decline, they become criminals to both sides. Outside the shelter, the sun was starting to descend, creating extended shadows across the wilderness landscape. Traoré realized they had been conversing for nearly 3 hours. I cannot make these choices alone, he stated finally. Nor can I provide assurances without proper procedure. But I can initiate the effort, and I cannot rely on simple words from a government representative. El-Gazawi replied. We have heard commitments previously. Traore considered this deadlock, then made an unprecedented proposal. What if we commence with a localized cessation of hostilities? One province, 30 days. You withdraw your combatants. We withdraw heavy military deployment. Joint community patrols, your men and mine collaborating together. We introduce development resources. Begin reconstructing infrastructure. An experimental case. El-Gazawi's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes displayed interest. Which province? Your selection. This surprised the rebel commander. After a moment's consideration, he stated, "Sooner my birth province." Traore acknowledged. It was one of the most severely affected regions, a stronghold of rebel activity. Selecting it demonstrated seriousness on both sides. 1 month, commencing next week, Traore confirmed. If it maintains, we expand to adjacent provinces. If it fails, we both understand this was our sole opportunity. They discussed implementation specifics as darkness descended, how to communicate, how to manage potential disruptors, how to prevent foreign interests, particularly France, from undermining the delicate process. As they concluded, Traore made one final appeal. "Before I depart, I want to encounter some of your combatants to hear directly from them." El-Gazawi appeared surprised but consented. Outside, he summoned 3 men of different ages. The eldest, perhaps 50, had been a cultivator before government forces destroyed his settlement, suspecting rebel support. The middle-aged man had been an educator until schools closed due to the struggle. The youngest, barely 20, had known nothing but warfare for most of his existence. Traore spoke with each briefly, inquiring about their experiences, their aspirations. Their accounts reinforced what he already understood. This struggle had complex origins that military force alone could never resolve. As he prepared to depart, El-Gazawi approached him one final time. "You assumed an enormous risk arriving here," the rebel commander stated. "Why?" Traore looked out at the wilderness night, stars appearing in the vast sky above. "Because someone had to break the pattern. Too many have perished while we discussed talking about discussions." El-Gazawi extended his hand, a gesture both simple and significant. "In 30 days, we will discover if this was wisdom or foolishness." Traore accepted the handshake. "Regardless, we will have attempted what has not been attempted previously." The journey back to Ouagadougou was lengthy and solitary, providing Traore time to contemplate the magnitude of what had just occurred and what lay ahead. By the time he reached the capital near sunrise, he had developed a plan for proceeding without causing immediate political turmoil. He entered the presidential complex through a side entrance, hoping to reach his quarters before anyone noticed his absence. He was unsuccessful. "Mr. President," the voice belonged to Colonel Ouedraogo, his security chief, who stood in the darkened hallway with a worried expression. "You've been absent for 24 hours. No communication, no security detail." Traore had expected this. Confrontation, a required time alone. "Colonel," to contemplate. "With respect, sir, that is unacceptable. We've been on high alert. There are procedures that I establish," Traore interrupted gently, "and that I can adjust when necessary." Rose studied him closely. "You weren't at your settlement." "We verified." Rather than lie further, Traore made a choice. "Walk with me, Colonel." "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave the two of us for now." In his private office, secure from surveillance devices, Traore revealed the outline of his encounter with El-Gazawi. As expected, Ouedraogo was initially shocked, then furious at the risk Traore had taken. "It was a calculated choice," Traore explained calmly. "If I had been killed, Vice President Keba would have continued our policies. But if I succeeded, we succeeded, thousands of lives could be preserved." "And did you succeed?" Ouedraogo asked, skepticism evident. "We've agreed to a 30-day cessation in some province beginning next week, an experimental case for potential broader harmony." Ouedraogo shook his head in disbelief. "The military will resist. The French will undermine it. The public will be divided." "All accurate," Traore acknowledged, "which is why we need to approach this carefully. No public announcements yet. We quietly redeploy forces, monitor the situation, prepare contingencies. If it fails, we've lost little. If it shows promise." He left the sentence incomplete, the implications clear. Over the following days, Traore held confidential briefings with his most trusted counselors, the defense minister, intelligence chief, and foreign minister. Reactions ranged from cautious optimism to outright opposition, but Traoré's authority prevailed. Careful orders were issued for a strategic redeployment in some province language, vague enough to avoid immediate questions. 6 days after his wilderness encounter, Traoré received a text message from an unknown number. "The hawks are in their nests. The doves may fly." It was El-Gazawi's confirmation that his combatants had withdrawn from offensive positions. That same day, Traoré ordered the removal of heavy artillery and reduction of military presence in key areas of Somme. He replaced them with a newly formed community security unit, regular soldiers paired with local volunteers, focusing on protection rather than offensive operations. The first week passed in tense silence. Both sides expected betrayal, a resumption of violence. It didn't come. By the second week, residents of soon began to notice the change. Markets reopened, farmers returned to fields long abandoned. Children played outside again. In the third week, Traoré took his boldest step yet. Without public announcement, he traveled to Guibo, the provincial capital of Somme that had been under virtual siege for years. He brought with him engineers, medical staff, and resources for immediate infrastructure repair. The local population was stunned to see the president walking freely through their streets, listening to their concerns directly. What they didn't know was that the night before, El-Gazawi had also been in Guibo, ensuring his remaining combatants maintained the cessation and gauging community response. The two leaders never met in public, but a secure phone line kept them in communication as the experiment unfolded. By the fourth week, news of the dramatic changes in Sou had begun spreading throughout Burkina Faso. Journalists questioned the shift in military posture. Opposition politicians demanded explanations. Foreign embassies, particularly the French, expressed concern over what they termed security vacuum. It was time to go public. On the 28th day of the cessation, Traoré addressed the nation from Guibo itself, a powerful symbolic choice, with local leaders from diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds standing behind him. He revealed the outline of what had transpired. "1 month ago, I took an unprecedented step in search of harmony," he began, his voice steady. "I met directly with Muhammed El-Gazawi, leader of the Shadow of the Sahel movement." Audible gasps could be heard from the assembled journalists. This was not a surrender nor a negotiation with terrorism. It was a recognition that after 10 years of struggle and 12,000 deaths, military solutions alone have failed. It was an attempt to break the cycle of violence that has destroyed communities across our north. He went on to describe the localized cessation, presenting it as a Burkinabe solution to a Burkinabe problem. He emphasized that no foreign powers had been consulted, a deliberate jab at the French, whose counter-terrorism operations had often exacerbated tensions. For 28 days, not a single civilian has died from struggle in SA province. Markets have reopened. Schools are preparing to resume. This is not yet harmony, but it is a glimpse of what harmony could look like. Traoré then announced the expansion of the model to 2 neighboring provinces, with a clear framework: gradual military redeployment, joint community security units, accelerated development projects, and local governance reforms addressing long-standing grievances. To those combatants still in the wilderness, I say this: there is a path home. Not through amnesty for crimes against civilians, justice must still be served, but through a process of disarmament, reintegration, and reconciliation that recognizes the complex roots of this struggle. The address was met with a mixture of hope, skepticism, and outrage. Military hardliners condemned negotiating with terrorists. Opposition parties accused Traoré of endangering national security. The French embassy issued a statement expressing serious reservations about the approach. But in the streets of Guibo, something remarkable happened. As Traoré walked among the people after his address, an elderly woman approached him, took his hands in hers, and simply said, "My grandson can sleep through the night now without fear. Thank you." That evening, on the secure line, El-Gazawi provided his own assessment. "Your address was well received in our communities, but there are challenges ahead. Foreign combatants are arriving from militant. By those who profit from chaos, they will try to break this harmony." "And your authority over your forces?" Traoré asked, holding, but strained. "They need to see tangible benefits soon. Jobs, development, dignity. Words alone won't sustain this." Traoré understood the fragility of what they had begun, one step at a time. "Tomorrow, we begin the expansion to Udalan and Yaga provinces. Your combatants there, they have their orders: no attacks, maintain defensive positions only, allow development teams to enter. The next 3 months tested the framework repeatedly. Twice, rogue elements within the insurgency attacked government positions. Each time, El-Gazawi's loyalists helped identify and neutralize the perpetrators. Once, an overzealous military commander ordered an unauthorized raid on a suspected insurgent hideout. Traore had him immediately reassigned. Gradually, the experiment expanded to 5 provinces, then 8, not without setbacks. Violence still erupted, trust remained fragile, and foreign interests continued, attempting to undermine the process. But a pattern emerged where the framework was implemented. Civilian casualties dropped by over 80%, economic activity resumed, and communities began the long process of healing. 6 months after his wilderness encounter with El-Gazawi, Traoré took the most controversial step yet. He invited the rebel commander to participate in nationally televised harmony talks in Ouagadougou. The invitation sparked protests from victims' groups, resignations from 2 cabinet ministers, and a stern diplomatic note from France. Yet persisted when El-Gazawi arrived in the capital under heavy security, and having laid down his weapons as agreed. It marked the first time in African history that an active rebel commander had been brought into a formal harmony process without first being defeated militarily. The talks were difficult, emotional, and often nearly collapsed. Victims confronted perpetrators. Religious and ethnic tensions flared. The military establishment resisted compromises on security arrangements. International observers questioned whether lasting harmony was possible, given the deep divides. On the talk's 3rd day, during a particularly heated exchange about accountability for atrocities, a young woman stood up in the audience. She identified herself as having lost her entire family to a rebel attack 2 years earlier. "I have every reason to want vengeance," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "But what would that bring back? Not my parents, not my brothers, not my village." She looked directly at El-Gazawi. "I do not forgive what was done, but I want the killing to stop. I want other families to remain whole." Her intervention changed the tenor of the proceedings. Discussions shifted from recrimination to practical solutions for sustained harmony, security arrangements, development priorities, governance reforms, and mechanisms for justice that balanced accountability with reconciliation. After 2 weeks of intense negotiations, the Ouagadougou Accord was signed, not a perfect document, not a complete solution, but a framework that could evolve. Its core principles included removal of foreign military bases, decentralized governance for northern regions, integration of former rebels into community security forces, and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As El-Gazawi signed the document, ending his status as Burkina Faso's most wanted terrorist and beginning his new role as part of a transitional Northern Governance Council, he exchanged a brief look with Traoré. In that moment passed the unspoken acknowledgement of how unlikely their journey had been from mortal enemies to cautious partners in harmony. The international reaction was mixed. Regional leaders expressed support, many facing similar struggles in their own countries. Western powers were skeptical, particularly France, which stood to lose significant influence under the new arrangements. Global terrorism experts debated whether the approach could be replicated elsewhere or was unique to Burkina Faso's specific circumstances. 1 year after the secret wilderness encounter that had started it all, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the outskirts of a settlement in some province that had been abandoned for years due to the struggle. Now it hummed with life, homes being rebuilt, fields cultivated, a school in session. Next to him stood Muhammed El-Gazawi, no longer a rebel commander but still a complex and controversial figure in the country's evolving story. "Did you believe this was possible?" Traoré asked quietly. "When you sent that correspondence asking to meet?" El-Gazawi considered the question. "I believed it was necessary to try. After burying enough combatants and seeing enough civilians suffer, even the most committed warrior questions the path of perpetual struggle." They watched as children played in the settlement center, their laughter a sound that had been absent from this region for too long. "The harmony remains fragile," Traoré acknowledged. "There are still attacks, still distrust, still foreign interests trying to destabilize what we've built." "Yes," El-Gazawi agreed, "but each month it holds is a month that rebuilds trust. Each school that reopens, each market that thrives, each family that returns home, these strengthen the foundations." What neither man said aloud but both understood was that their unconventional approach had fundamentally changed the narrative of struggle resolution in the region. For decades, the only models had been either total military victory rarely achieved, or superficial negotiations that failed to address root causes. Their third path, difficult, dangerous, imperfect effort, something different, a locally owned process that recognized the complexity of modern struggles and the need for solutions. That went beyond military force. As they walked through the reviving settlement, a group of elders approached to greet them. One, a woman in her 70s, spoke with the directness that often comes with age. "You too brought back our homes," she said, looking between the president and the former rebel. "But the road ahead remains long. Will you continue walking it together?" The question hung in the air between them, embodying the uncertainty of their nation's future. Both men had taken enormous personal and political risks. Both had been changed by the process. Both faced opposition from within their own constituencies. "The alternative is to return to a struggle neither side can win," Traoré replied finally. "For the sake of these children, we must find a way forward." El-Gazawi nodded in agreement. "The weapons have fallen silent in much of our land. Now comes the harder task, building a harmony that lasts beyond personalities, beyond politics." As the sun set over the settlement, casting long shadows across the recovering landscape, Traore reflected on the improbable journey that had begun with his solitary drive into the wilderness 1 year earlier. A single conversation had not solved all of Burkina Faso's problems. Violence still erupted in parts of the country. Political opposition remained fierce. Foreign powers continued their attempts to influence events. Yet something fundamental had shifted. A nation that had resigned itself to endless struggle had glimpsed an alternative. Communities that had been divided by violence were slowly reknitting their social fabric, a process owned by Burkinabe themselves, not imposed by foreign consultants or dictated by international institutions, was evolving according to local needs and realities. It had begun with a simple recognition that even the most intractable struggles ultimately require adversaries to see each other's humanitine, to excuse violence or erase accountability, but to find a path beyond perpetual enmity. As Traoré departed the settlement, returning to the capital and the countless challenges still facing his nation, he carried with him the image of children playing where once there had been only abandoned ruins. It was perhaps the most powerful testament to what becomes possible when leaders take unprecedented risks for harmony, when the weapons fall silent and the difficult, essential work of reconciliation begins.